Should the Bush tax cuts be extended in this lame duck?
Well, here's the way I describe it. If one is interested in job creation in the private sector, it is important to recognize that lower taxes enable the job creators, i.e. small businesses, to have more money in which to expand their workforce. And I think they ought to be extended.
Does the incentive model work if it pays more after tax to work, save, invest, and take risks?
Of course it does, and my record shows that. We had over 40-something months of consecutive job growth, and I believe a lot of that had to do with the tax cuts.
That was, of course, President Bush in an interview with CNBC that aired earlier this evening. A very familiar face speaking very familiar words, which altogether formed a very familiar George W. Bush argument. That not only do tax cuts create jobs, the evidence that they do is right there in the George W. Bush presidential record for all to see. Because for nearly all of the 2 terms Mr. Bush served as president, the Bush tax cuts were in effect. The tax cuts Bush signed into law in 2001 were accelerated 2 years later when he signed a new act into law, one that ironically had the words jobs and growth in the title. These tax cuts were designed ostensibly to create jobs, and President Bush, again tonight, claims that his record shows that there was job growth during his administration. And he's right. 1.1 million jobs, according to the U.S. Department of Labor, 1.1 million jobs over nearly 8 years. So, George W. Bush isn't lying when he says that his administration created jobs in an economy featuring lower tax rates. What's not clear is the cause and effect relationship between the tax rates and the jobs. Mr. Bush lowered tax rates from the era of President Clinton, so by the lower taxes create more jobs theorem, Mr. Bush's administration saw more job creation than did Mr. Clinton's. Actually, no. By a factor of 20 or so. Wrong by 2,000%. The 8 years of President Bill Clinton, the country netted 22.7 million jobs. The policy argument for the Bush tax cuts is pretty weak tea. Almost, I would say, non-existent. It's far more illuminating to understand the Bush tax cuts not as an attempt at job creation, but as one among many examples of what political scientist Jeffrey Winters calls the income defense industry. Here's the average American household income after taxes from 1979 to 2006. In those 27 years, the poorest 20% of American workers saw an 11% rise in average annual income. In comparison, what did the top 1% see? A 256% bump, from somewhere right below $400,000 to $1.2 million. The hallmark feature of the American economy over the past 3 decades is rising inequality and a larger and larger share of national income being captured by a smaller and smaller group of extremely wealthy people. And in response to this, Bush, the entire GOP, and some Democrats propose extending tax policies that exacerbate rather than mitigate the problem. They want to pour fuel on the inequality fire. That's the agenda. Given the recession, you can argue that middle-class and low-income people need a tax break right now, but at the top of the income scale, that argument falls apart. And yet the zombie arguments for it never seem to die. Joining us now is Jacob Hacker, political science professor at Yale and co-author of an amazing new book on this topic. It's called Winner Take All Politics, How Washington Made the Rich Richer and Turned Its Back on the Middle Class. I really highly recommend it. Jacob, it's great to see you.
Thanks for having me on, Chris.
Okay, let's first talk about the post-tax inequality. I mean, what role has tax policy in the Bush years and the Reagan years before that and throughout, what role has that played in the rising inequality that you and Pearson document in the book?
Well, if you listen to some commentators, it doesn't play a big role because they're mostly looking at the middle of the income distribution. For people making $50,000 or $100,000 a year, changes in tax rates haven't really made a big difference. But when you start looking at the top of the income distribution, at families with $1 million or $5 million or $25 million a year in income, then you're talking about huge cuts in the effective taxes that they're paying. Cuts that are so large that just recently Warren Buffett complained that he was actually paying a higher tax rate than his secretary. So for the very top of the income distribution, my co-author Paul Pearson and I say that there's been these big economic smart bombs that have been delivering payloads of cash to carefully selected wealthy recipients. And that's been the story not just of the last 10 years, but really of the last 25 and 30 years.
One of them, since you talk about a smart bomb, one of the smart bombs that I've been reporting on since I got to Washington is the hedge fund loophole. There's a loophole for what's called carried interest, and it means that hedge fund people can take home money and it gets taxed at a much lower rate than the wages that you would make from income. Why does that thing refuse to die?
Well, I mean, it really is perhaps the greatest illustration that this is more than just good arguments at work, because everyone agrees that the carried interest provision is a huge boondoggle. It's essentially a loophole in the tax code that allows these hedge fund managers to pay only 15% on their $100 million, $200 million, billion-dollar incomes. And the reason it survives is basically that neither party has had the courage to take it on, because it's so complex. Most voters don't know anything about it. And so 4 years after the Democrats capture Congress vowing that they're going to take this on, it's still on the books. And it sort of happens to die in the Senate one time or in the House another time. But, you know, conveniently, it never makes it to the point where it's seriously challenged. And I think that's very revealing about what Paul Pearson and I call winner-take-all politics. And
finally, I'm going to give you the difficult task of distilling the argument you make in the book about how government actions have affected pre-tax inequality, what people actually make, not the tax rates, distilling that down to a TV-friendly 30 seconds, and that can get you out of here.
Well, that's a challenge, but I think I can make it very simple. So we tend to think that, you know, government just redistributes income, but we all know that government has a huge effect on pre-tax incomes. And if you want one illustration of that, I give you financial market deregulation. These folks brought our economy to the brink of ruin and made millions because basically government opened up all these opportunities for gambling with other people's money. So these titans of finance weren't superstars that were surfing some kind of new global technologically rich economy. They were basically people who were enabled by government policy to make millions at our expense.
Yale professor Jacob Hacker doing an admirable job of that, co-author of Winner Take All Politics, which, again, I cannot recommend highly enough. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on, Chris.
Coming up on The Last Word, hip-hop entrepreneur Russell Simmons. Don't miss that. And on this show, The Simpsons vs. Fox News. Excellent.